Okay, looks like everybody is in, so I'm going to get started. Hello and welcome. My name is Ryan Tappy, and I work with the ALS Association. Thank you for joining us for this latest installment of Empowering Your ALS Journey, a webinar series. The goal of this series is to empower you to live fully and with purpose, regardless of where you are on your ALS journey. And the title of today's webinar is Grief, Mental Health, and a Sprinkle of Hope. There are a few things we want you to know before we begin. First off, please know that you are muted and not on camera so you can relax and enjoy the presentation. There will be time at the end of this webinar to answer questions. You should see a chat box feature on your screen as well as a Q&A feature. You can use either of these options to submit questions you may have. All messages submitted will only be viewable by the host and panelists. We will review and answer these questions with our speaker at the end of the webinar. We do have a very short survey we are asking that everyone complete after the webinar. The survey will appear in your browser once the webinar ends. This survey helps us know your thoughts on this presentation and topics you would like us to consider in the future. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website in the educational webinar page within about a week. Throughout a diagnosis of ALS, individuals and their family members are confronted with feelings of grief and loss. To help make sense of these feelings and provide some practical tools for coping, we are joined by social worker and ALS Association Care Services Coordinator Erin Major. Erin, a native of Iowa and the daughter of two teachers, was determined not to be a teacher like her parents. Instead, Erin chose the path of social work and ended up specializing in neurology, which is something she was familiar with since her father had epilepsy. The bulk of Erin's experience began with hospice, where she spent 10 years before moving on to the Multiple Sclerosis Achievement Center at KU Medical Center. 2 years ago, Erin began working at the ALS Association as a care services coordinator. In addition to this work, Erin supervises social work students at the Parkinson's Exercise and Wellness Center. When she is not submersed in the world of neurology and social work, Erin crams her free time with lots of fun activities, which I will let her tell you about. Today, Erin is here to teach you about grief, loss, and hope. I will now turn it over to Erin, and I will hop back on to facilitate the question and answer after the presentation. So, Erin, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Ryan, for the intro. I'm so excited to be here talking to you guys today about this subject. It's something that's very near and dear to my heart. I truly believe that because if we have healthy grief and mental health, those are the cornerstones of a well-functioning, supportive society. And my hope is that you're going to take away at least one pearl of wisdom from this presentation. So, Ryan has already told you about my professional background, and I will tell you the more fun stuff, which is a little about me and my family. I've been married to my husband for 13 years, and these are our two boys. I grew up in Iowa. Now I live in Kansas City, but you can take the girl out of Iowa. You can't take Iowa out of the girl. And it's really become my home here in Kansas City, though. Next is my cat, Felix. He's the one that always makes appearances in my Zoom calls. So some of you on here might have actually seen him before. And then we have Stripes. He's our cat that is always into mischief, the troublemaker. And our dog Connie, she thinks she's the queen. So this is quite a heavy topic, and you guys might be wondering what you've gotten yourself into, what the next hour is going to look like. So I wanted to just dispel some of those fears that you might have. First of all, this is not going to be all doom and gloom. There are some difficult topics that we're going to discuss. However, I think that you will find the coping skills section at the end of this to be more uplifting. I'm providing education to let you make your own decisions, so there's no need for me to scare you into anything. And toxic positivity is something that really drives me crazy. In this world we live in of social media, people are always highlighting the best things that happen, and you don't always see the things that go wrong. And so I don't think that allows people to really be authentic. But when you are living with ALS or caring for someone with ALS, I think you're entitled to have some bad days. And I would say it's even probably expected. And lastly, I will certainly not be diminishing anyone's hopes or goals. It's going to be quite the opposite, really. I'm a big believer of preparing for the worst, but hoping for the best, always keeping hope front and center. What we are going to talk about today is the grief process in order for you to have some realistic expectations for you and your loved one. We're going to talk about the difference between what's normal grief and what might require some further help from a mental health professional. At the end of this presentation, we're going to talk about coping skills and ways to increase your tools that you have in your self care toolkit. And finally, my goal is to validate your feelings, your experience, and to leave you with a sense of hope. So let's just start with the definition of grief, because most of the time people associate it with death, but it is a lot more than that. It's an emotional response to a significant loss, and that loss could be any number of things. It could be loss of a job, an identity, a major life change. And those complex experiences involve a lot of emotions, thoughts, physical sensations, and the grief process looks different from person to person. So, I'm sure you can imagine why grief is a bit of a tricky thing to discuss because most people aren't really clamoring to have a discussion about end of life, grief, and loss. And unfortunately, we live in a death denying society. So that makes it difficult. Women out there, if you can imagine the first time you were pregnant, if you did not have the book, What to Expect, and nobody would talk to you about the experience of going through pregnancy, that would be such a scary and lonely experience. And yet, that's kind of the way we approach end of life. So I hope to change that by doing some education. And there are different reasons why everyone's grief response looks so different. And the reasons are a lot of it depends on the nature of the disease and, maybe how aggressive of a disease it is. It has to do with the person's unique personality, their characteristics, the person who is diagnosed, their characteristics, their support system, cultural background, religious or spiritual influences, other stressors that they have going on in their life, and earlier experiences with death. So, what a lot of people don't realize is that the grief process actually starts as soon as someone gets a terminal diagnosis. And the reason for that is because you are grieving two things. One, you're grieving the person you were before your illness, and you're also grieving your future self and all the plans that you had made, which no longer exist. And some of the other losses that you face are things like functionality and identity. And another one that's sort of interesting is loss of the assumptive world. And what that means is that we all live with these ideas, such as we assume that young people don't die, and we assume that if you eat healthy and exercise, you'll live a long time. So when a diagnosis like ALS comes along, it can really just be a shock to your core. So, considering all of those losses, it's not a surprise to me that sometimes our patients at the clinic at KU Med don't always want to accept the strategies that the healthcare team is telling them. And I know sometimes my coworkers may get stressed out, like, "Gosh, if Jim would just use this walker, he'd be a lot safer." But when you think about all the things that you guys have already been through, it's not a surprise that you want to have some control over a few things. I love this cartoon because I think many of us felt this way during the pandemic when we were constantly hearing about the new normal. And it's just like, ugh, nothing about this feels normal at all. But you are constantly having to adjust to changes. And I would say the people that I was working with at the time with neurological conditions, they had progressive multiple sclerosis. They actually handled the new normal probably better than I did. So, grief affects our whole person from an emotional, physical, cognitive, behavioral, and spiritual arena. With the emotions, it's a wide range. It's not just sadness. It can be shock, numbness, anger, guilt, and anxiety. As far as how we feel it physically, it can change our sleep, our appetite, our energy levels, and even we can have physical pain from it. So I always try to tell people going through grief, like also caregivers, to please make sure that you continue to go to your doctor's appointments, just so you care for your physical health as well. Cognitive changes. It takes a lot of energy to grieve, and so that can affect your concentration, your memory, and even decision making. Behaviorally, sometimes people just they have to withdraw from social activities, their routines are changed, and then other different behaviors because of the loss that they're going through. And finally, grief can really shake us and our faith. It can make us question life and death, the meaning, the purpose. And I would just like to say that I don't think it's at all um, a weakness of faith if someone is questioning things. That came up a lot when I did hospice work. And I would say that God can probably handle all of those emotions. And so it's normal to question. All right, my coworkers, they already know that I get on a soapbox about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. This is another one like the toxic positivity that drives me crazy. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a physician and in 1969, she published the book on death and dying, and it was groundbreaking. She had observed people living with terminal cancer and she interviewed them. She did extensive interviews. And at the time, it was very helpful to know all this. But we've come a long way since 1969. And now I think we know that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work wasn't necessarily researched in the most thorough way. And grief is just so complex that kind of having stages is not always what grief looks like. And I think Elizabeth Kubler-Ross eventually realized that because she she actually died of cancer herself. And she said her work was never meant to be prescriptive. Like, if you get through the grief stage, or not the grief stage, if you get through anger, then you move to bargaining. She said it was just meant to be a framework. And so now you guys are going to notice that when you watch TV shows, movies, anytime they're talking about death and dying, they quote, they use Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work. Um, but the fact is that many other researchers have come up with great models that make a lot more sense. There's a guy named Bill Warden and Therese Rando. I really like their work. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's assistant, David Kessler, he actually added a sixth stage. And just for a refresher, um, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And he added a sixth one, which is finding meaning, because he felt that that could transform grief into a more hopeful experience. This is what grief actually looks like. Um, it's probably a little hard to read, so I'll just go through. There are just a variety of emotions: shock, numbness, denial, anger, fear, disorganization, panic, loneliness, depression. And then as you come on the upswing, things start to get better. New strengths, new patterns, hope, and affirmation. But as you can see, grief is actually very messy and it's not a linear process at all. When I was a hospice social worker, this was one of my favorite handouts to give to people because I don't think that this is necessarily common knowledge. And a lot of the people I worked with when I did bereavement counseling were kind of shocked by some of these things. For one, they were so surprised about how exhausted they felt, and they just didn't know that grieving was going to take that much energy. The other thing is that when you have a new loss, it can resurface old issues, even things that you think, oh, I've resolved that. That's in my past. I'm over it. Sadly, grief can just stir it all back up. And of course, we expect the emotion of sadness, but sometimes people are surprised by their feelings of anger and guilt. And also, they can find themselves irritable, frustrated, annoyed, having low tolerance for frustration. And I can relate to this. I think that grief can bring out the best in us, and it can also bring out the worst in us. And when my dad was dying of terminal cancer, I do remember having those feelings. Um, and you just have to give yourself a lot of grace for that. Some people say they feel like they're going crazy because they can't think clearly with their grief. It's kind of like in the first 3 months of a loss, then you're in that brain fog. I think it's almost a protective factor so that you can go about the business of living. But that's what that's about. And then society can definitely have unrealistic expectations about your mourning, which is the way you express your grief. And unfortunately, sometimes people say things that are very unhelpful. And I'm sure that you guys have experienced this. It's not necessarily anyone has ill intentions, but they'll say things like, well, have you tried yoga? Or do you think this could be Lyme's disease? I think sometimes people just are uncomfortable with end of life, death and dying and loss, and they don't know how to respond to really hard things. So, the best thing supporters can really do is just say, I'm so sorry you're going through this, full stop. It's better than kind of putting their meaning into things. And again, grief can make you question your faith. Okay, so there are different styles of grieving, and I think it's helpful to know this because sometimes people get frustrated with their loved ones because they're grieving differently. And one person might think that the other person's not doing it right, when in fact, there is no really right or wrong way to do it. It's almost just the way we're wired. So, intuitive grievers, they really get in their feelings. It's not uncommon for them to cry. They get strength and find solace from openly sharing. They find that it helps them to talk about their emotions. They like reminiscing and storytelling. Well, then we have the instrumental grievers that are maybe more logical. They're tuned into their thoughts versus their feelings. And they profess their grief very cognitively. They'll focus on external problems. They're very also task oriented and purpose. And they tend to be more private and solitary with their grief. That doesn't mean that they aren't grieving, it's just that they're processing it a little differently. And children, that could be a whole nother presentation, honestly. They, um, it looks a little different depending on their age, but if a child is old enough to love, they're old enough to experience grief. And actually, sometimes I would say children cope even better than adults because they kind of fluctuate between intuitive and instrumental. They 1 minute might be crying about the loss of a loved one, and then 10 minutes later, they're just running off to the playground. And that's very normal. And I think we could actually learn a lesson from kids in feeling our feelings, but also going about the business of living and carrying on. So obviously, grief is very related to our mental health, and our mental health is such an important component of our overall health. People talk a lot these days about anxiety and depression, and so I thought it'd be helpful to just kind of define what those are. And grief does look a lot like these, so it can get complicated. So, anxiety is a persistent feeling of anxiety or dread that interferes with how you live your life. It's different than occasionally worrying about things. And this criteria is taken from the DSM-5. That's the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual that mental health providers use for making diagnoses. And you have to have three of the following symptoms for a course for the past 6 months: restlessness, feeling fatigued, difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbance. And for depression, the symptoms only have to last for 2 weeks, but every day, most of the day, and some of those are a diminished interest or pleasure in most or all activities, weight loss or gain, insomnia or um, sleeping too much, psychomotor retardation, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness, diminished ability to think or concentrate, recurrent thoughts of death. And each age group experiences depression a little bit differently or behaves differently based on that. For kids, you may see them being anxious or cranky. They might pretend to be sick or refuse to go to school, cling to a parent, that kind of thing. For older kids, you may see them getting in trouble at school, sulking, being easily frustrated or restless, having low self esteem. And sometimes there's other disorders like ADHD or substance use disorder. In young adults, kind of similar. You may notice irritability, weight gain, negative life view. In middle age, you can see decreased libido, middle of the night insomnia, or early morning waking. Um, these folks may complain of stomach problems like diarrhea, constipation. And for older adults, they can feel sadness, grief, or other loss symptoms. They may have a lack of emotions versus a depressed mood. So again, it does get a little tricky because normal grief and clinical depression are so similar. Um, I think what's most important to know when you would get concerned about someone in their grief process is if they're having persistent withdrawal from their family and friends, if they're not taking pleasure in the things that they used to really enjoy, if there's constant anger, complaining, irritability, constant sadness or inactivity, new fears that won't go away, long lasting regressive behaviors, or repeated illness. That's kind of when you might realize that there could be some deeper stuff going on. And that brings us to probably the heaviest topic of today's talk, and that's suicide. I really feel that this is an important topic to speak about. I did lose a patient to suicide a few months ago, and it was absolutely shocking and devastating. And I asked myself if there was something I should have done differently. And it just really bothered me until I finally realized I needed to stop shoulding all over myself. And what I could do is I could go forward with the knowledge that I have and try to educate other people and let them know that this is something we should be talking more about to make sure that people get the help that they need. And in doing my research for this talk, I found a study that talked about how people with a terminal illness are at an increased risk for depression. And that in turn makes them a higher risk for suicide, with the highest risk being in the first 6 months. And it does make sense to me why that would be the time frame, because I think when someone first gets diagnosed, there's so much fear, and you can be really overwhelmed with all the information that's out there. And so my hope is that folks will get connected to the association and partner up with their care services coordinator, because there is so much that we can do to help support people so they don't feel alone, and so that they're comfortable talking to someone openly about what their fears are, um, because there may be maybe some things that would give them peace of mind if they were asking the questions. I will say though, it's very normal for someone with ALS to have passive thoughts about suicide, to just say, just want this to be over, or I just don't want to wake up tomorrow. Um, we always want to take suicidal thoughts seriously and keeping in mind whether or not there's a risk there. And there's a suicide ratings severity rating scale that a lot of the practitioners use. It's called the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. And I always encourage people, if you are having any kind of suicidal thoughts, you can reach out to the National Suicide Hotline at 988. It's staffed around the clock, and those people that answer the phone are so caring and knowledgeable. And you don't have to even be in a crisis to use that number. If you just need someone to guide you, or if you're worried about your loved one having those thoughts, you can call and they can talk you through it, what next steps would be or that kind of thing. Okay, well, the good news is there is help out there, and care services coordinators are very skilled at finding resources and getting you connected to the, the people that can help the most. Through your Medicare or your private insurance, you can call up the 1-800 number to find out what therapists are in your network in your area. There are some therapists that don't take insurance, but many of them do work on a sliding scale fee. And if you are having financial struggles, you can always go to a community mental health center. They offer a lot of great services based on your income. A website that I really like to use is Psychology Today because you can search for therapists and read about their bios, kind of get a sense of who would be a good fit for you. And you can search by, who takes your insurance, that kind of thing. There's a really wonderful handout that I came up with, and this is the link for it. You can always email me after the presentation if you want me to send this to you. I'd be happy to do it. It's so great, and it gives a lot of practical strategies. This everything is awful, and I'm not okay. Um, they may not seem like rocket science, but when someone's really in a dark place, it's hard for them to think about their basic coping skills. And so this handout will ask things like, have you showered in the past day? Have you eaten in the last 3 hours? Are you hydrated? Have you seen a therapist in the past few days? And yeah, there is a whole list of things. It's a great handout. And I think it's really important for you to remember that even with a diagnosis of ALS, you are still driving the train. You still get to decide a lot of things. And I think now is a good time to just have open communication with your families because if you're prepared, then when an emergency happens, family knows exactly what you want and what you don't want. And I think palliative care and hospice are great resources that can kind of help people talk through some of this stuff. Palliative care allows you to continue with treatment, and they're amazing. KU Med Center is very lucky because we have palliative care nurses that come to our clinic and meet with people. And hospice, of course, I'm biased because I did that work for so long, but it's a great resource for when people decide that they're just ready to be done with going to the hospital. They want to stay comfortable at home and just work on their best quality of life. I would encourage everybody to make an advance directive. You don't need any fancy legal work to do that. Probably the social workers at your clinic have access to a blank form that you can fill one out. And that's just to spell out the things that you would and would not like at the end of life. And it's helpful for your DPOA, and DPOA stands for Durable Power of Attorney. So that person is designated to make wishes on behalf of you only when you are unable to do it yourself. And if they have an advance directive to look at, it helps them to carry out your wishes. And finally, I think we should all have funeral plans or at least a sense of that because we are all going to die someday. I used to tease my hospice patients. I would say funeral planning starts with fun, um, but you have to be ready for that. So now, some of you are still thinking about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and you're disappointed. What about this acceptance that she told us about? How can we get there? Well, the problem with this acceptance is it's very misleading because it implies that your grief is just going to end. When in reality, it ebbs and flows like a wave. And you don't have to accept every aspect of living with ALS. The goal is just to be flexible to adapt to the changes. And one good strategy is that it's easier to think about the things that are still within your control. And there are things in your control, like you can educate yourself about your ALS. You can go to clinic and ask your questions. You can advocate for yourself or your loved one. You can participate in groups. Basically, managing your health becomes your full-time job. And I came across this really wonderful quote by Claire Bidwell Smith. She's a licensed grief counselor. She said, "Acceptance does not mean that you are okay with the diagnosis. It just means that you are learning to live with the knowledge of it while holding space to grieve." Okay, now up until this point, we've discussed some heavy stuff, and I promised you that we're gonna get to some uplifting stuff. So this is where it begins. There are a lot of things that we can do to increase these awesome hormones in our body. Dopamine, the rewarding chemical, oxytocin, the love hormone, serotonin, the mood stabilizer, and our endorphins, the painkillers. This is a great handout I found from the Parkinson's NSW website. So now I'm going to give you 10 strategies for self care. And there are many other options available to you. These just happen to be some of my favorites or things that I think are of the utmost importance. I know, exercise. It's not my favorite one, but look at the benefits. It reduces your stress, boosts your mood, makes your brain sharper, can lower anxiety and depression, make you sleep better. If you're exercising in groups or with a PT, then that's increased social support. I mean, folks, it just doesn't get much better than this. Um, there's so many different forms of exercise. You can find one that's enjoyable, not too torturous. Although I think many of our folks with ALS are real go-getters. So you guys might love exercise, but I encourage all of us to um, find ways to keep moving. Journaling. I know I can hear you guys groaning from over here. This is not everybody's cup of tea, but listen to the benefits. It can help you get organized and get your priorities in order. Just imagine this. In your brain, you have all these thoughts swirling around, and to journal means you just get those thoughts out of your head and you anchor them to the paper or your computer screen. Um, it's it can lower your cortisol, help you improve your sleep, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. No one's going to edit your journal. It doesn't matter if you spell stuff wrong, have bad grammar, it doesn't matter. Um, the important thing is that you do it. And you could even just set a timer like, okay, for 10 minutes a day, I'm going to jot down some notes. I once had the opportunity to shadow a psychiatrist who was an expert in sleep. And one of her pieces of advice was if you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep, or you're having trouble sleeping, make a list of all the things that you're worried about and then cross off the ones that you can't control. So I thought that was pretty cool. Then, there's things that you can take action on. You can also use prompts, things like if there's something particular you're worried about, what's the worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario, and what is most likely to happen. Okay, cuddling with your person. I have some wonderful friends that are occupational therapists, and they have impressed upon me how important it is for us as healthcare workers to talk about sex and intimacy because it is such an important part of people's lives. And I know there can be a lot of embarrassment around the subject, but intimacy is really important for us. And things like hugs and massages, hand massages, those are ways that you can increase your oxytocin, the love hormone. And the ALS Association did a webinar actually a few months ago by Kim Wallace on sex and intimacy, and she's a wonderful presenter. And so I remember one thing she said in a talk, I've seen her present a few times, is that intimacy is not just about sex. Anything that you wouldn't do with your cashier at Walmart or whatever store can be considered intimacy. So, you know, a squeeze of the shoulder, anything like that. And so it's important to just continue those bonds that you have with the special person in your life. Pet therapy. I'm sure no one is surprised that I love this based on my intro screen with all of my animals. Animals are so good for us. Just petting a dog or a cat helps our body release oxytocin. And I love nothing more than when I'm on a support group meeting or um, something, any meeting when someone's pet shows up in the screen. Like it's great. And for those of you who don't have a pet, but you just need a little TLC from a dog, there's animal rescues that allow you to take a dog out just for the day, which I think is pretty cool. I foster puppies and it's life-giving how great it is to be around those sweet little fur balls. Canine Companions is a really neat organization that trains emotional therapy dogs. They are golden retrievers and Labrador retrievers. And the program's so well received that there's often a waiting list, but that's something that you could look into. Number 6, find your purpose. There is an incredible book written by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. He was a survivor of the Holocaust, and he went on to become a psychiatrist. And what he found, his observations from the concentration camp, were that people found a lot of hope in having a purpose, in finding meaning. And his book is really wonderful, but it got me thinking about how we all just want to learn things and to teach others. And I am really proud. This is a shameless plug for the ALS Association, but we have some really awesome ways for people to stay involved and have socialization. We have a really neat program called Creative Pursuits, and that is all about just different hobbies and how we can make them adaptable. We have, or accessible. We have art classes. We have a writing class. I lead a book club. And, there's all kinds of neat things. Recently, somebody asked me, "Well, what about adaptive video gaming?" So I told Liz Stanley, and we're, trying to work through to see if there's more interest, so we're always trying to think about ways that we can get people to connect. Our support groups, well, special shout out to the First Tuesday, 4 o'clock group, who might be on here giving me moral support. And I think they would back me up in saying that these support groups are not all doom and gloom. We laugh, they brainstorm solutions if someone's having a problem, and they care about each other as more than just the diagnosis. They want to know about, one another's kids or what vacations people have coming up. And those are all on Zoom. So we are able to let people get involved from all around the country, and there's a lot of different days and times that we offer them, so generally everybody can find one that works for them. We have the ALS registry that's done through the CDC, and that's an awesome way to contribute to the research in which they just send you surveys to ask different things like what your occupation used to be, um, where you grew up. You can fill as many of these forms out as you want to or as little. Um, Someone said they asked what cleaning products uses. At the CDC, they're just trying to figure out what is the common denominator. What do people have in common that could be a potential cause or trigger for ALS? And then we also have an advocacy department that contacts our state representatives and, you know, tries to let them know how important it is to keep doing funding for research and things like that. So hopefully there's something that interests you, and we would love to tell you more about any one of those programs that we have. Number seven, it seems so obvious, but breathing. Um, we forget to do it. We get stressed and don't breathe enough and or we don't breathe deep enough. So these are two neat strategies that I've learned. The first one is called alternate nostril breathing. And you just power down your eyes. You can practice this if you want because you're not on camera. And you just breathe in through one side and breathe out through the other. And you just alternate it. This is a tactic that I learned in a yoga class. So give that one a try. And then this is another one I thought was pretty cool that the Navy SEALs use box breathing. They imagine drawing a box and they breathe in for 4 counts and they hold it for 4 counts. Then they breathe out for 4. And I've tried this and it really does work. So those are easy. You can do them anywhere. A lot of people find that prayer and meditation are very good for just grounding them. And I think it's a way to practice mindfulness and let all of the problems kind of fall by the wayside for that time. Some people are not spiritual or they're not religious, but they may find comfort in nature. And I would say that's just as wonderful to kind of um, just give you peace of mind. Humor, I'm a big fan of. And just the other day, I was visiting with one of my clients who she's what I would consider a young person. She's in her 40s and her sister is her caregiver. And they were telling me how they just got to giggling because the person with ALS was zipping around the lobby of the clinic while her sister tried to chase after her, and she just kept moving her power wheelchair. And I love to see them laughing. And, we can laugh or we can cry. So the only thing I would caution is that sometimes people use humor to deflect from the pain they're feeling or the hard emotions. And so again, I think that it's good to have both. It's good to have things to laugh about, but also moments when you can be serious um and just talk through the harder emotions. And 10, music. It's so good for our souls. When we sing, the neurotransmitters in our brain fire up the temporal lobe that releases endorphins, can do all these great things for us, make us smarter, healthier, happier, more creative. It's even better if you sing in a group. Um, and it can even synchronize our heartbeats. I just think that is so cool. It can help lower our levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, and anybody can sing. Now, I didn't say they can sing great, but it doesn't matter. You can sing in your car, you can sing in your shower. Um, just do it. And lastly, know your tribe. Who can help with what? So I think that, a lot of people will say to you, "Oh, I'm sorry you're going through this. What can I do to help?" Well, the problems with that is it puts it on the griever, the person that has 700 things going on. What's more helpful is if someone offers, "Can I take your dog on a walk? Can I mow your grass?" But people don't always know to do that. So you can come up with a list of ideas and then just be prepared for the next person to ask, "What can I help with?" There's a lot of different things. You could have someone set up a meal train. You could have someone set up a caring bridge, which is a website where you can kind of do journal entries, just giving people health updates. Um, Social support kind of comes in three different personalities. You have your friends that are doers, like they're going to get things done. They'll call up your insurance and ask a bunch of questions. They will, um, you know, any number of things. They'll help you find a caregiver. They like a task. Then you have some friends that will just treat you like normal. Like Like, they always treated you even before you had ALS, and they'll just they might not be good about talking about the touchy-feely stuff, but they'll make you laugh. They'll they'll just have a great time with you. And then there's the people that are really good listeners, that are comfortable with the emotional stuff. So it's good to kinda keep those personality traits in mind. Everyone fills a different cup for us. And most importantly, I'd urge you to accept help. Um, you don't have to do this alone, and that goes for both caregivers and the people with ALS. That we hope that you'll be in touch with your care services coordinator because again, there are a lot of solutions that they can offer and just emotional support of having walked this journey with many people. So that is all. I'll leave you with this quote by Stephen Hawking. "However bad life may seem, there's always something you can do and succeed at. While there's life, there's hope." Thank you guys, and I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Yes, thank you, Erin. That was a great presentation, some great information and insight. We really appreciate you joining for that. We do have a few questions here, and I'm just going to try to go through them. A couple are more general questions, and some are more personal to the person's specific experiences. The first one we got was let me find it here. An audience member's a family member of an audience member calls her scared and sad about his diagnosis, and she struggles with how to respond to these comments when I guess she's being accused of being scared of his diagnosis. Any advice for responding to maybe more more of those aggressive comments regarding the diagnosis from the person with ALS and where they're at in the process?
I find that unfortunately some people are they're really just going to say the wrong things. And I think it's good for us to be aware of who doesn't have the capacity to kind of support us in the way that we need to be supported. And I think, sometimes we might have to limit the amount that we're keeping in touch with certain people. Um, and I think also it's just good to remind our loved ones that everybody grieves differently and what's right for one person may not be right for you, and that's okay and normal.
Great, thank you. Um, are there any approaches that you would suggest when when one family member is grieving faster than another family member, and maybe wondering why that other family member is still struggling or struggling more than they are? Do you see that often? Is that something that's common?
Yeah. And I think it kind of goes back to those different styles of grieving, the instrumental versus intuitive. And I would also say that grief is going to take as long as it takes. And um and no one ever just really gets through it. They get or no one goes can really go around it. They just have to go through it for however long it takes for them. So maybe the person isn't grieving fast, they're just grieving differently.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's great advice as well. Okay, a couple more here that I have. Any advice for someone who doesn't feel like they're grieving right, how you might respond or guide them?
Well, first, I would assure them that they probably are grieving right, unless they are just worried about themselves and maybe they're really thinking that they need more support than they're getting. In which case, I'd really encourage that person to reach out to um, a mental health therapist, someone that can process it with them, and they may be doing better than they think they are.
Okay. Any advice when there's a lack of a support system? And this person specifically mentions that they are finding themselves less in the role of a spouse and more in that caregiver role now.
Yes. Um, I think that that kind of is a reflection of how becoming a care, I like to call it care partner, that it does change the role, and sometimes you kinda lose sight of maybe the intimacy of that you had with your spouse, and so I think that people have to be very intentional about that, and if at all possible, to take time for themselves if they can find, anyone that can come, even, for an hour a week or um, there is a lot that can be done with Zoom. So if it's very hard for a care partner to get out, then I would consider, of course, I'm always going to say come to our caregiver support groups. But it's a neat way of meeting people that really get what you're going through. The trouble with ALS being such a rare disease is that you guys often get kind of isolated because no one in your realm may really understand just exactly what it's like. So that's the advantage of talking to someone in the support groups.
Sure. And going kind of off of that question, I know there's been some questions that mentioned their partners having dementia, and with that role change, even of no longer feeling like a spouse and more like a caregiver. Do you feel people grieve those smaller losses, those loss of independence, loss of the partner you used to know, loss of that role as a spouse,
Yeah,
and now you're in that role of caregiver? And can you just touch on that?
sure. I think that that's a real thing that when someone is losing their cognitive abilities, you start to lose them much longer than maybe their physical decline happens, and you sure do grieve that, and I think sometimes that anticipatory grief is what helps prepare you for their, eventual death, end of life. It's such a process.
Absolutely. And one final question, because I know we're a little over time here. Just generally, any advice for someone who doesn't know how to comfort their loved one or what to say when they're searching for support?
I would just say that verbatim. "I don't know how to support you, but I'm here for you."
Hmm.
That is the best thing you can say. Um, it's hard because we all want the perfect thing to be able to fix it, make it better, and there are just no words that can really sum that up, but I think if you just hold space and you listen to them, like, if you need to talk, I will listen to you.
Great. Great. Well, thank you for all that. And unfortunately, we are out of time, but I would once again like to thank our wonderful speaker, Erin Major, for this amazing presentation. I do have a couple quick reminders before we end today. You can view a recording of this webinar on our educational webinars webpage, which can be found at als.org/webinars. You can also use this webpage to view recordings of all the past webinars we have hosted, as well as sign up for future webinars. We do include the slides along with the recordings. Please note that due to our big ALS Nexus conference in August, We will be pausing this webinar series for the month of August, but we will be returning with new topics in September. Thanks to some wonderful donors, we are able to offer free registration for ALS Nexus for individuals diagnosed with ALS and their caregivers. If you're unfamiliar with what ALS Nexus is, or you're interested in learning more about ALS Nexus, you can visit als.org/ALS-Nexus or visit our website and type ALS Nexus into the search bar. And lastly, a final reminder that you will receive a short survey when we end this webinar, and we hope you're able to complete that as it really does help us to improve these. Thank you to everyone who was in attendance today, and thank you again to our speaker, Erin Major. We hope you have a great rest of your day.